Hey everybody, welcome back to 2BeLikeChrist for our Mark chapter 15 study. We are almost done with the book of Mark. We got one more chapter after this one. I cannot lie, I'm pretty excited to get through Mark just because it seems like we're covering almost the exact same information as we did in Matthew, and I'm ready to go on and see what John has to say because John's significantly different. But remember, there's free notes for this study out on the website in the link below. And there's also a free ebook. Grab that, and there's a copy on Amazon.com if you want that. Check out the other videos. We're doing more short videos now, along with these Bible studies. I had people who really wanted both, and so I'm trying to incorporate both. It takes me a little bit longer, but some good stuff. I just uploaded a video earlier today or yesterday, depending on what time you're watching this. Mark chapter 15, let's get into it. This has got 47 verses, but it goes relatively quickly because so much of it's narrative. Verse 1, and as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. So Jesus has been arrested. You remember in chapter 14, there was the betrayal of Judas, the arrest of Jesus, the betrayal of Peter, and now it's the morning after all of this phony trial has gone on through the night. Now it's the morning, and the chief priests have been not only physically abusing Christ, but also legally abusing Christ. And after probably a sleepless night in the custody of his abusers and the other Jewish elite, Jesus is led out to the Roman governor, and his name is Pontius Pilate. Who was Pontius Pilate? Pilate was the 5th governor of Judea. I actually want to change my notes there. He's the 5th governor of Judea, and he was preceded by a guy named Valerius Gratus. And really the only reason he's significant to this story is because he's the one who appoints Caiaphas to be the high priest. Caiaphas is the high priest, as we talked about if you were with us in the Matthew study, and he was appointed by the guy who came before Pilate. So you notice there, if you know the Old Testament, you will maybe think that's a little bit strange because the high priest was supposed to come from the line of Aaron. It wasn't just supposed to be an appointed position, but there was a bunch of corruption that had gone on, and now the high priesthood was no longer a position that was what it was intended to be in the beginning. And so when Pontius Pilate comes and becomes governor of Judea, he retains Caiaphas as the high priest. The historic records, my eye is itchy. Sorry. The historical records don't tell us a whole lot about Pilate. We know that he had quite a few run-ins with the Jews, and that eventually got him removed from his position. He does not seem to really have a splendid political career after his time in Judea. And you might ask, well, why did the Jews take Jesus to Pilate? And there's a couple reasons they may have done that. It seems like they may have wanted the backing of Rome before they committed a murder that might incite the people. They were worried about an uprising among the people, and if they could get Rome's backing to this, then it wouldn't be such a big deal. But if they had started a riot, Rome would have held them responsible, and they would have been in trouble. Other people suggest that maybe they took him there because they didn't have authority to do any kind of capital punishment. Not sure if that's true or not, but they may not have had authority to crucify, and that is what obviously needed to happen, God's will, but also probably what they wanted, and so going to Pilate would give them the authority to do that. Verse 15, and the crucifixion also fulfilled many prophecies, so that's what I mean by God's will, not that God wanted this sin to occur necessarily, but I think you understand what I mean. Okay, sovereignty, that whole deal. Mark chapter 15, verses 2 through 5. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus had no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That's the accusation that had been brought against him. "Are you the king of the Jews?" And that was a significant question politically to ask because Herod had claimed that title, the king of the Jews, and he was reigning over the Jewish people under the authority of Rome. So if Jesus was also claiming this title, it could potentially mean that there was some political subversion going on, that maybe he was trying to take over Herod's position, and the Romans obviously wouldn't have liked that. So just as a politician, as a ruler, this is a significant question for Pilate to ask. And Jesus doesn't answer Pilate directly. He actually says, "You have said so." Some people think that that's an affirmative answer. He's saying, yes, I am. You have said it. Other people take it as more of a probing question, like this interrogation has been turned around. Jesus is now asking Pilate questions instead of the other way around. Similar, if not identical, to the record of John in John 18, verse 34, where Jesus answers him, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Basically asking him about what is it that he believes. Is he just parroting what other people said, or does he say this because he believes it and really wants to know the truth? So the chief priests, they continue to pile on accusations, even though that we learned earlier they couldn't even get their false witnesses to agree. Apparently they were going for quantity rather than quality here, and they continue to just add accusations. And to Pilate's amazement, Jesus doesn't defend himself. A defendant in court who's been accused of something that they didn't commit is probably going to be really quick to throw out all the evidence to suggest that they're innocent. And yet Jesus doesn't do that here. It's really a fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 53, where it talks about Jesus being afflicted, being oppressed, and yet not opening his mouth like a sheep that's led to the slaughter. That's Isaiah 53, verse 7. That whole chapter is about Jesus. If you've not read that, you should go back and check that out. And Pilate probably knew that the accusations that the chief priests were bringing were bogus, but he was astounded, and it probably led to his astonishment that Jesus didn't make a defense. Certainly, if this man was really as big of a troublemaker as the chief priests were saying, Pilate probably would have heard about him before. But he doesn't seem that worried about Jesus. Verse 6 through 10. Now at the feast, that's Passover, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. Apparently there was a custom at the Passover that the people could request a prisoner to be released. This probably isn't too different from our political pardons that sometimes get handed out at the end of a political term, or maybe around holiday time. Same idea. And the people get to decide who's released, apparently. And Pilate gives them this choice. He says, "Do you want Jesus or do you want Barabbas?" In Matthew chapter 27, verse 17, that's spelled out a little bit more clearly. And we're told that Barabbas was a notorious prisoner. It says, the verse we just read, that he was a murderer. And Pilate probably thought that maybe Jesus wasn't the most popular choice. Maybe there were people trying to influence the people otherwise, but certainly they would not ask for a murderer's release over this man who had just been delivered on trumped up charges. Pilate knew, and he gathered, which I think is probably why he asked the people. Well, he gathered that the chief priests had brought Jesus to him, not because he had committed a legitimate crime, but because the high priest and his friends were envious of Jesus. And so he asks the people, "Who do you want me to release?" Knowing that a lot of them probably don't have any problem with Jesus, and probably thinks that the people's vote will get him out of this situation. The people will ask, certainly not for the murderer, but they'll ask for Jesus. It doesn't really turn out that way, though. And Pilate probably was able to gather Caiaphas's motives and understand his motives because, as we mentioned, he kept him in office as the high priest. And so evidently he knew at least something about who Caiaphas was and maybe what motivated him. And he was able to recognize here that Caiaphas he had no interest in truth. He just wanted Jesus dead. Verse 11 through 15. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him released for them. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Whatever influence the chief priests still had on the people was significant enough to get them to ask for the release of a hardened criminal instead of the man who had gone throughout their villages healing the sick. So obviously, significant influence on the people. And the crowd asked for the release of Barabbas, and they asked for Jesus to be crucified. And here we see that Pilate is backed into a corner. And he says, "Why? What evil has he done?" Oops, missed something there. Typo. Fixed. And you notice when Pilate asked this, what evil has he done? The mob, the crowd, doesn't respond with a coherent answer. They just keep shouting that they want him to be crucified. They don't have any real accusations. And I thought there were so many parallels between that and what we often see in the modern world. How often do leaders relent to permit or even to support some godless thing? Not because those who are supporting the godlessness present a case based on evidence and logic, but because they just yell and they keep yelling and they keep making a noise until those who are in authority, who are worried about the security of their political positions, they get worried and they relent, right? At this point, the Gospels reveal to us that Pilate had at least two indications that Jesus was innocent. The first one was that he had talked to Jesus and he didn't find any fault in him. The second was that Pilate's wife had had a dream. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 27, verse 19, that Pilate should leave this man alone because he's an innocent man. So Pilate has two indications here. And even with those on his mind, he didn't want to incite the Jews for fear of for fear of an uproar, because an uproar in Judea might be a stain on his political career, because the Romans just want the Jews to behave. That's Pilate's job. And if there's an uproar in Jerusalem at Passover time, it's not going to look good to his superiors. And so he relents to the mob. And as I mentioned, the same thing happens all the time, not only in the political, secular side of things, leadership in our world, but it happens in religion as well. I mean, how many churches, denominations have caved to cultural pressures from the mob to support things that the Bible doesn't support, or to decide that they're going to reinterpret the Bible to support things that the Bible never should be reinterpreted to support. And the reason is because they're afraid of the mob. And again, the mob doesn't have any good, logical, rational, biblical reasons for trying to push the agenda that they are pushing. They just want it for some reason, some sinful reason, right? And so they yell and they scream, and a lot of people get real intimidated by that yelling and screaming and threatenings, and they relent. And that's exactly what Pilate does here. So we need leaders with principle, and we need leaders with backbone, not a bunch of Pilates leading our political arena, in the political arena, or in our churches. Verse 16 through 20. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed them in a purple cloak, and twisted together a crown of thorns, and they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, They stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Jesus was then turned over to the Romans once they get Pilate's approval for this, and this whole battalion has gathered, and they mock the idea of Jesus as a king or as a ruler. And, I think it's interesting here. The Jews and Herod didn't want Jesus to be their king. The Romans didn't want Jesus to be their king. They thought they were in charge. The Jews and Herod didn't want, or actually they played judge over Jesus, condemning him, even though he was innocent. The Romans then turned around and they played judge and condemned Jesus, even though he was innocent. And I began to think about that and that role of judge and king. Both of those roles are ultimately and going to be finally claimed by Jesus. But anytime you have men trying to fill a role that only Jesus can do perfectly, you're guaranteed to have some corruption. They claimed that title, king and judge, but they were not the king and judge that we want. And that got me thinking about just man-made government in general. In the United States, we have the executive, the judicial branch, which is the president, or you could say the king. The judicial being the courts, the judges. And you look at the Old Testament and how the people wanted a king, and their earthly kings failed them again and again and again and again. And the Old Testament is really a message to the Jewish people that the king that you really need is God. And now that the king is finally here, they end up rejecting him. But your earthly kings are not going to get the job done because they are corrupt, many of them. And even when you have a good streak for a while, eventually things fall back into corruption. I think, in terms of government systems, there's no perfect government system so long as men are running the government. Any system of government, eventually, when sin takes hold, is going to be corrupted. I think that's the great thing about the invitation of the kingdom of God, and why we need to put our stock in the kingdom of God, not in some human institution or government system. The kingdom of heaven is the only kingdom that is ruled by the perfect king and the perfect judge, and the one that's not going to be subject to all kinds of corruption and just it's not going to fall apart. And so put your stock there instead of anywhere else. I know that's hard, I think, for a lot of Christians who they think that the government is going to be what saves them, that the government has to stay intact or everything is going to fall apart. No, not true. Many Christians have lived within the perfect kingdom of God, under the perfect king and judge and rule of God, but also in an earthly sense underneath a corrupt government. And that's the beauty of what God calls us to, rather than what we get stuck with based on the country that we live in. They dressed Jesus up like a king and they mocked him and just thought it was ridiculous that he would claim to be a king. But now, 2,000 years later, that claim's not so ridiculous, because there are still people in the kingdom of heaven who are active and who give their allegiance to King Jesus. There's no one anymore who gives their allegiance to Herod, no one who gives it to Pilate, no one who gives it to Caesar, no one who gives it to the Roman Empire. But Jesus, there are millions of people in his kingdom. And so, not so funny now, not so mock-worthy now. Verse 21 through 23. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Cyrene was a city located in North Africa, and Simon was probably in Jerusalem because he had come to celebrate the Passover. There's a map in your notes that shows you where the city of Cyrene was located. I don't know if there's a city there anymore or not, but that's where the ancient city was located. So a good bit of ways to the west of Jerusalem. If you look into some of the historical sources on the cross and what those crosses were like, it explains why Jesus needed somebody to help him bear this burden. And the tall beam of the cross, the middle beam, many suggest would have weighed upwards of 300 pounds. And then the cross beam the horizontal one would have weighed, 100 pounds plus, somewhere around there. So you're looking at 400 pounds of weight, and 400 pounds of weight is a lot of weight, even if you're just dragging it. And even if it was 300, even if it was 200, that'd be a lot of weight. I don't know if you've ever lifted a 200-pound barbell, but carrying one up a hill, good luck. 400 pounds that's a lot of weight. Anyway, that may have been doable for Jesus on a healthy day, but remember, he's been beaten, a lot of blood loss. He's probably had a sleepless night. And so that 300 pounds, 400 pounds, whatever it was, would have felt like 1,000 pounds. And then it says here that they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. There's some discussion about what that was, this wine and myrrh, or I think Matthew calls it gall. So most people think that it was some kind of a painkiller or numbing agent or something like that. And here Jesus refuses it. Not exactly sure why, but maybe so that no one could accuse Jesus of not feeling the full suffering of a crucifixion. That may have been the reason that he rejected it. Verse 24 through 26. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them, to decide what each should take. And it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." The 3rd hour, I'm actually going to add this to my notes right now. 3rd hour equals 9 a.m. Hope that's right, and I didn't botch that off the top of my head. The 3rd hour would be 9 a.m. So, we've come through the night. Now Jesus was arrested last night. They waited till morning. They brought him before Pilate, and now he's being brought to be crucified 9 a.m. That statement there at verse 24, and they crucified him, probably has to be one of the most abbreviated statements ever. Mark doesn't give any of the information about the brutality of the crucifixion, about nails going through your hands and your feet. It just says they crucified him. And for a Jewish audience, or rather for a first century audience, they probably didn't need any graphic detail about what a crucifixion looked like. They would have known. And yet there's all that horror, but it's summed up in this tiny little statement. They were probably more familiar with crucifixion than they wanted to be. And the history books tell us that a lot of times people were just crucified on the road, and they were crucified on the road because when people passed by, it was like a shame to them. And so people would have seen this if they were around any Roman soldiers, probably. And it says the soldiers who crucified him cast lots for his garments. It wasn't uncommon to be crucified naked. That's not something that is publicized a whole lot, because I don't think people want to imagine Jesus like that. We don't know exactly. I don't think we know for sure whether or not he was crucified that way. But obviously his garments were taken and they cast lots over them. We'll talk about what that means here in a second. But and being crucified naked, again, would add to the shame of the whole process. Just a way of killing somebody that was meant for maximum shame. Casting lots is not something that we necessarily do today. I think it would be similar to drawing straws. In some cases, it seems to be just random chance. But there were times in the scriptures that it was guided through divine providence. And you can read about that in the Old Testament and a little bit in the New Testament. But they were basically drawing straws for who got Jesus's clothing. And as an additional insult, they put a sign above Jesus that read, King of the Jews. Verse 27 through 32. And with him they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the King of Israel come down now from the cross, that we may believe, that we may see and believe. And those who were crucified with him also reviled him. So in his death, Jesus was associated with 2 petty criminals. 2 thieves were hung beside him. And to make matters worse, his enemies, the Jewish elite, came by and mocked him one last time, or so they thought one last time, before he died. This would not be the last of Jesus, as you probably know. But you can imagine the self-discipline, though, that would be required to have infinite power, to be hanging on a cross, naked, injured, beaten by these people. These people just come by you hanging on the cross to mock you, as if they hadn't done enough to you already. And you have the power to snap your fingers, to call 12 legions of angels out of heaven, and to just wipe these people off the face of the earth for all time. And yet Jesus doesn't do that. And the self-discipline required not to do that would have been immense. Knowing that he struggled with the same human emotions that we struggle with, maybe only Jesus was capable of holding back that vengeance and revenge. And it says that 2 thieves that were crucified with him mocked him as well. You talk about the pot calling the kettle black. Ridiculous here that even hanging on a cross with people, with somebody else, that you could look at them and mock them. Verse 33 through 34. Oh, one other thing that Mark's gospel doesn't tell us, but that's revealed in one of the other gospels, is that one of these thieves changes his mind, realizes he's wrong, and repents of what he's done and asks Christ to save him. Verse 33 through 34. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, or lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I've heard that pronounced both ways. I don't know which one it is. I've heard lama sabachthani, and I've heard lama sabachthani, which is typically the one you hear. But take your pick. My God, why have you forsaken me is the meaning of that. And so miraculous darkness covers the face of the earth around midday, when the sun typically should be shining at its brightest. Again, we have the 6th hour reference and the 9th hour. 6th hour is 12 p.m. 9th hour is 3 p.m. And around 3 p.m., Jesus cries out with this statement. And the statement is not Greek, and it's not Hebrew. It's actually a language called Aramaic. It has a couple of people call it different names, but typically you'll hear it called Aramaic. And just as a side note here, there was a video that I found online, kind of by random chance, that it's about a village in Syria that still speaks Aramaic. And they suppose that it's somewhat similar to what Jesus spoke. And so I actually put the link in the notes. You can copy that. It's on YouTube, and you can actually hear a little bit of maybe what Jesus sounded like, because the people speak the language in the video. The meaning of the statement is provided for us. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And there's been a tremendous amount of debate about what that means. Is Jesus separated from God here? Has God abandoned him? What's going on? How can God be separated from God? What's the spiritual realities that are going on here? And I'm not sure that we're ever going to be able to fully understand all the spiritual realities that occurred here, because they're just not explained to us. But I think we can understand this passage, and maybe it's not as complex as a lot of times we make it, if we reference back to the Old Testament to see what's going on here. So here's my view on what Jesus means when he makes this statement. The first thing to recognize is that he doesn't just pull this out of thin air. He doesn't just make this statement up or this cry. It's not original to him. These words are actually found in a quotation from Psalm chapter 22, verse 1. Psalm 22 was written by David in a time of despair, and he begins by expressing his feelings of being or feeling abandoned by God. But he ends up closing that psalm with the realization that he hasn't been abandoned. And there's several other verses in Psalm 22 that directly relate to Jesus. You can see Psalm 22, verse 18, which we just referenced about Jesus's clothing being the casting lots for his clothing. And so it comes from Psalm 22, and we now know a little bit about the context there, what's going on, what David is saying in Psalm 22. And so what's Jesus getting at by quoting Psalm 22? Well, let me ask you this. If I said, "The Lord is my shepherd," if you're familiar with the Bible or you've ever been to a funeral, and I said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," what are you going to think about? Probably going to think, oh, Psalm 23. I know where that is. And then many people can quote Psalm 23. And so there's a small section of words that are so familiar to us that it draws our minds back to the entirety of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. Ah, yes. So when Jesus is doing this, and remember, he's talking to a group of people who are probably much more familiar with the Psalms than we are today. And so if I'm a first century Jew familiar with the Psalms, and someone said to me, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Just like in Psalm 23, when you quote the first verse, people know what you're talking about. Psalm 22, they would have known what Jesus was talking about. They're like, he's quoting from Psalm 22. So why does he want the people to remember Psalm chapter 22? Well, I think for a couple reasons. The first one would be this. Jesus is showing the people that Psalm 22 is being fulfilled on the cross. Even a verse like verse 28, which says, "For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations." What a strange what a strange verse to reference in many people's minds at this point, because they're thinking, we thought Jesus was the king. We thought that he was the man anointed by God, the Christ. And here he is hanging up on the cross, being mocked that he is a king. There's a sign hanging above his head mocking the fact that he's a king. And Jesus quotes Psalm 22, which says, "For kingship belongs to the Lord." What Jesus would be alluding to in saying that is that this scene may look bad to you, but this is showing that God, and will show as this all progresses out, that God has been on the throne all along. Kingship belongs to God, even in this scene where it appears to be the complete opposite. And then the second reason he wants to draw their minds back to Psalm 22 is to reveal to the people that even in this moment, when it appears that God has forsaken them, just like David talks about how it appeared that God had forsaken him, that even in this moment, God was worthy of praise. Because as the psalmist wrote, "For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him." Psalm 22, verse 24. God is in this scene. And so my understanding of this is that Christ is not abandoned by God literally. And he quotes Psalm 22 for the benefit of those listening who were probably under the impression that they were observing a godless scene. Where is God? God has abandoned us. Our king is hanging on the cross. God cannot, this is terrible. This is not what we thought. And Jesus is pulling their minds back to finish the psalm. They're in verse 1 thinking they're abandoned. Jesus is saying, God's still on the throne. God is going to bring this to completion. And it may look like he's turned his face away from this scene. If you finish the psalm, though, you'll realize that's not the case. And that Christ is the fulfillment of what was going on there. So that's my understanding of why he quotes Psalm 22, verse 1, while hanging on the cross. Verse 35 and 36. And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down." Evidently, there's some confusion about Jesus' words here. I think it's kind of understandable why there might be. There's some plausible reasons why Jesus might not have been completely understood here by some. It doesn't say by all, but by some. The first one is that I think the one that my mind goes to first is that Eli sounds something like Elijah, and Eli in Aramaic is apparently somewhat similar to Elijah in the Greek. Not only that, but Jesus is obviously not in the best shape at this point, so his articulation may not have been the best. There's probably a lot of noise around this scene as well, so they may not have heard him perfectly. And it could have been that the people who misunderstood were foreigners who had traveled to Jerusalem for Passover, and maybe were not as proficient in Aramaic as a local speaker. So those could have been the individuals who misunderstood what was happening here. Not only that, but there was also all of this discussion about Elijah and whether John the Baptist was Elijah and what all of that meant. And so that factors in here as well. It says, someone then took a sponge and filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and lifted it to Jesus' mouth for him to drink. And some of the crowd then waited to see if Elijah would actually show up. Verse 37 through 39. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." After hanging on the cross for several hours now, about 6 hours, Jesus cries with a loud voice and then dies. I'm always amazed at how brief this section is. We talked about how summarized the crucifixion is, and then here, death of Christ is just very quick. And I suppose it doesn't need to be long. There's no reason for it to be long, otherwise God would have made it longer. But I don't know. It's the center point. This and the resurrection, really the center point of the Bible, and it's just very quick. I don't know. Just always struck me as odd. There are several events that accompanied Jesus' death. The first one was that the veil in the temple was torn. To understand that, you need to understand a little bit of Old Testament history. The Jewish temple had two rooms, the holy place and the most holy place, and they were separated by a curtain. You can read about that curtain in Exodus chapter 26, verses 31 through 33. I have that in the notes, but I won't read it. So it's separated by this curtain. It's a big old thick curtain, and says that curtain tore in two from the top to the bottom. So what's the significance of that? Well, the only person in the Old Testament who was allowed to go on the other side of that curtain to the most holy place was the high priest. Only the priest could enter in there. They had a special relationship with God, and they had to bring the sins of the people to God for those sins to be atoned for, or atoned for in the Old Testament system. Just leave it at that for now. So you had to have a priest, okay? But what's significant about the temple veil tearing seems to be a communication that now everyone has access to God. God's presence dwelt in the most holy place. And it's not just the priests any longer who have access to the presence of God. It's everyone. It's all the faithful to Christ. And the book of Hebrews will reveal that all Christians are priests. And we all have access to God, to go before God, to ask for forgiveness from God. And so that pathway has been opened. The curtain has been torn. And it's probably significant. Well, it's obviously significant because it's recorded, but it tears from the top to the bottom. And that may signify that this wasn't a man. Well, it's a picture of heaven and earth, right? It tears from the top, from heaven to the earth, not the other way around. It's only God who could give men justification through the sacrifice of Jesus. Only he could make the way to him available. Human beings could never do that. That could never be done from the earth to heaven, from the bottom up, right? There's nothing that men can do to merit or earn their salvation. God has to do that, and he did it through Christ. And so the curtain rends from heaven to the earth, God being the terror. The second significant event was that there was an earthquake, and a third event that's recorded in Matthew. Can't really say this is an event that occurred at the crucifixion, but it's mentioned in this same area of the crucifixion in Matthew's account, was that after Jesus' resurrection, there were dead that rose from the dead along with Jesus, and they went into the city and actually were seen by other people. So that you can read about that in Matthew's account. But Mark records a detail here that Matthew doesn't give us. It's interesting. And that detail is that the centurion who was there at the cross, after seeing the events of the last few hours, he determines that this was, in fact, the Son of God. All that he's seen has convinced him. The sun going black for 3 hours in the middle of the day would be not something that you see every day. And, an earthquake and these other things that went on would have had obviously had a powerful effect on the people that observed them. Not only would the centurion change his mind about who Jesus actually was, but evidently the same things that played on his mind to make that change played on the mind of one of the thieves on the cross, who ends up changing his mind that mocking Jesus is a good idea and realizes that he needs Jesus to save him. So, verse 40 through 41. There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. I like these few verses because it gives us a little bit of a picture into Jesus' ministry that we don't have in other places, and a lot of times. When I think of Jesus' ministry, I picture it in my mind. Just by default, I always imagine an all-male entourage. But here, it tells us that that wasn't the case. There were women who not only followed Jesus, but also ministered to him, served him, took care of him, and probably the apostles as well, and the people that were following him. So they played a vital role in that ministry, and I like that it highlights that. We know that here there were several women here present at the cross. It's difficult to lock down the exact identities of them because the gospel writers refer to different women in different ways. But we know that obviously some of them are told to us very specifically. We know that Jesus' mother was present at the cross, and the mother of James and John was also present. Matthew chapter 27, verse 56. The wife of Zebedee, which is James and John's mother, which would have been the same woman who had come up to Jesus and asked him if her sons could be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, which we looked at in an earlier study. Okay, verses 42 through 47. Let's finish off the chapter. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he had already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. So it was the day before the Sabbath, the day of preparation. And there wasn't supposed to be any work performed on the Sabbath day, so they wanted to get Jesus down off the cross as quickly as they could. The text then introduces this new disciple of Christ, which we've not heard about before, Joseph of Arimathea. We don't know a whole lot about Joseph, but we know that he had some money and he had a tomb. Luke chapter 23, verse 50 says that he was a member of, quote, the council, which is probably a reference to the Sanhedrin, or the Jewish council, comprised of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And you notice the text says there that he took courage to ask for the body of Jesus. His actions may have actually been put his position on the council in danger, because he's showing Jesus a respect, and his other council members have condemned Jesus. Joseph goes to Pilate and he asks for the body of Christ so he can bury it. And Pilate was surprised that he was already dead. It wasn't uncommon for people to hang on the cross for days before they died. That was especially true if they didn't receive this scourging beforehand. But Jesus died after about 6 hours on the cross. Pilate's surprised. He has a soldier confirm that Jesus is dead. We'll read about that in another gospel account. But then when he confirms it, he gives the body to Joseph. And Joseph takes the body, and Matthew 27 says that he puts him in his own tomb. It's not just that he has, an extra tomb, but it's his own tomb. And this wasn't a grave like we often think of a grave in a cemetery. This would have been a tomb that was cut out of a rock formation, almost like a cave. And it says that a great stone was rolled in front of the mouth of the tomb. And that would have been to keep robbers out, to keep animals out, to make sure that the grave was secure. We bury people today, and generally the dirt keeps them safe. But the stone would have done an even better job. And the text then says that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, accompanied Joseph to the tomb and saw where he was buried. And they will... that's significant later. So that is Mark chapter 15. A lot of narrative there, so it went somewhat quickly for 47 verses. Chapter 16, I believe, is pretty short. So we'll get into that next time. And then I am going to take a little bit of a break, 2 weeks, not sure yet, before we start John. There's another project related to mission work that I'm working on. I want to slot it in there. So there will be a little bit of a break. I'd encourage you, if you're planning on doing that study with us, to read the book of John. Try to read the book of John every day. That's what I'm going to try to do for about 2 weeks leading up to that. And that way you'll have kind of the big picture, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty stuff. And you'll be able to piece them together, and that'll be really beneficial. Maybe try to read it. I don't know how long it takes to read it I do audio books, so I'm going to listen to it. But maybe I'll do half one day, half the next day. That's probably a little bit more reasonable. So we'll see how it goes. Anyway, I dropped another video on this channel, shorter videos, like 3 minutes long, about Peter and his denial of Christ earlier today. So go check that out if you haven't already. Remember, everything's linked down below. Share this study with a friend and subscribe to the channel. See you guys next time.